Today, Harris concedes to Trump but vows to fight on.
How unbridled rhetoric on inflation and immigration was ultimately a vote winner.
What Trump's victory means for his many legal troubles.
And what the new president-elect means for Fed rates and the economy in general. It's Thursday, November 7th. This is Reuters World News, bringing you everything you need to know from the front lines in 10 minutes every weekday. I'm Tara Oakes in Washington, D.C.
And I'm Jonah Green in New York.
The outcome of this election is not what we wanted, not what we fought for.
The concession speech. Vice President Kamala Harris addressing her supporters, many of them in tears, at her alma mater, Howard University, vowing to keep fighting for the ideals that powered her campaign to the White House.
While I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
And warning of potentially tough times ahead.
I know many people feel like we are entering a dark time, but for the benefit of us all, I hope that is not the case.
Later today, President Joe Biden will address the nation to discuss the election results and the transition. The White House says Biden has invited President-elect Trump to meet with him in the White House and expressed his commitment to ensuring a smooth transition of power.
As we look ahead to what Trump's second term might bring, political analysts are trying to understand just how Trump made such a remarkable comeback with such an unrestrained campaign. Reporter Graham Slattery has been digging into the data and speaking with Trump allies.
We've spent so much time looking at micro-demographics and elements of the ground game and just looking at very particular regions of states. But in the end, it was very, very simple. People were upset about inflation. They were upset about immigration. And he was able to hit those issues very consistently. People didn't like the direction of the country, and it created a situation where it was very, very difficult for Vice President Harris to be very effective. She was sledding uphill. And that's something we saw in all the exit polls we've examined. You know, in some ways, perhaps it was simpler than we realized.
Some donors thought that his dark rhetoric on migrants could hurt his campaign. Why didn't that move the needle?
In talking to his close allies, one thing that they think is that even when he says something that's very inflammatory or just patently false, when it relates to something like immigration, it keeps the news cycle focused on immigration rather than issues that are not as good for Trump in terms of voter trust. So, for instance, during his debate against Harris in September, he repeated these falsehoods about Haitian immigrants eating household pets in Ohio. A lot of allies were very concerned that that was going to hurt his standing with moderate voters. Perhaps it did, but it also created a two-week news cycle where there was very little discussion of the issues that were strong for Harris, such as democracy or reproductive rights, and created a two-week news cycle where people were talking about immigration, which is an issue that people trust Trump on.
As the Federal Reserve meets today, analysts are expecting Fed Chair Jay Powell to announce a 0.25 percentage point cut to the Fed's policy rate. And those promises Trump made on immigration and tax, which helped win him the vote, will now be issues the Fed has to factor into its rate-setting decisions. To help us understand how Trump's economic plans might play out, we caught up with our U.S. economics editor, Dan Burns, in D.C.
Donald Trump will return to the White House with really ambitious plans around broad import tariffs, immigration restrictions, and additional tax cuts that economists see delivering probably a short-term boost to economic growth, but also substantially larger budget deficits, weaker workforce growth, and ultimately potentially higher inflation. At the center of his proposals really are two things. The first is to extend all of the 2017 tax cuts that were enacted in his first term. He's added to that by also calling for some hefty new tax breaks. And the next, of course, is he has very aggressive plans for tariffs. He would like to impose essentially a 10% across the board tariffs on all goods imported into the United States, and even higher levies on imports from China. These would, if fully imposed, return the effective U.S. tariff levels to nearly 18%, which is the highest, according to the Tax Foundation, since 1934. It would result in essentially a one-time price increase effect for U.S. households, and that's something that some economists see ultimately as a drag on growth.
So how might his other policy plans affect the economy?
So he also has plans to restrict immigration, and that would have a notable economic effect, either restricting new arrivals or, if he follows through on his threats for mass deportations, that would cut into the U.S. labor force, and that it could reaccelerate wage growth, which has begun to come down a bit. And that's because employers would be competing to fill jobs from a more limited labor pool. So the combination of all that risks a rekindling of inflation that could mean that the run of interest rate cuts we expect from the Fed over the next year or so, there may just not be as many of them, and they may not end up being able to cut rates as deeply as currently estimated.
And if you want to understand more about the Fed's decision today, listen to our latest episode of Econ World podcast with Carmel Crimmins, where she talks about the elusive Goldilocks interest rate. There's a link in the pod description. Trump's win also means that he will soon become the first convicted felon to assume the presidency. And the 78-year-old stands charged with criminal offenses in 3 other cases.
So what does Trump's victory mean for those cases? Jack Queen is our legal correspondent. Jack, first remind us what the incoming president currently stands accused of.
So he technically has 3 pending criminal cases right now. One of them is in Washington, D.C. federal court over his efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss. There's another in Georgia state court about the same conduct. And there's a Florida federal court case about his handling of classified documents upon leaving office. And then finally, he was convicted earlier this year in New York state court, illegally covering up hush money payments to a porn star. And he is scheduled to be sentenced in that case soon, but it's actually unclear now when that's going to happen or if it'll happen.
And so what happens to all of these cases once he becomes president?
So the short answer is they go away. To unpack that a little bit, the federal cases, now again, that's the Washington, D.C. one and the Florida one, he can end those immediately his first day in office because the president is the chief federal law enforcement officer in the country. The attorney general serves at his pleasure, as do all of the people underneath the attorney general. We've reported that the DOJ is already looking at ways to wind down those cases and end them before he takes office, because there's also longstanding Justice Department policy that the DOJ cannot prosecute a sitting president because the president is the boss of the DOJ. So those go away. The Georgia state court case is a little different because it was not brought by federal prosecutors, but that one is also not long for this world. It's extremely unlikely, if not impossible, that a court would be willing to try a sitting president in state court, and they couldn't just delay it until after his presidency is over 4 years, because that would violate his right to a speedy trial.
And presumably he's not going to jail if he's sentenced later this month.
Sentencing a sitting president to prison, it's pretty much inconceivable. So it looks like he's all but guaranteed to avoid any serious consequences in that case.
A caravan of some 3,000 migrants has gathered in southern Mexico, headed to the U.S. border. The caravan comes after an easing of migrant crossings in recent months, and as President-elect Donald Trump threatens mass deportations of undocumented migrants currently in the U.S.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announcing his decision to fire his finance minister over budget disputes. The ruling coalition's collapse paves the way for a snap election.
Ukrainian forces have clashed with North Korean troops, according to Ukraine's defense minister. President Volodymyr Zelensky has said it marks a new page of instability in the world.
Israeli strikes in Lebanon have killed 40 people around the eastern city of Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley, according to the Lebanese health ministry. Further Israeli strikes hit multiple locations in the capital Beirut following Israeli orders to evacuate. The Israeli military has not yet commented. Today's recommended read looks ahead to next week and the UN's COP29 climate summit, with newly released data showing that this year is virtually certain to eclipse 2023 as the world's warmest since records began. You can read more about it by following the link in the pod description.
And for more on any of the stories from today, check out Reuters.com or the Reuters app. To never miss an episode, follow along on your favorite podcast player. We'll be back tomorrow with our daily headline show.